My name is Eleanor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and until last Tuesday, I believed the worst pain a woman could endure was burying her husband. I was wrong. I went out to the garage that morning, the way I did every morning since the funeral. Coffee in one hand, grief sitting quietly in my chest like it always did. I wanted to check on Robert's pride and joy. A pristine 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT500. It wasn't just a car. It was his life's work, the one thing that had survived 42 years of marriage, completely untouched by time. Instead of the familiar gleam of night mist blue paint, I found an empty space and a fresh drip of oil on the concrete. My hands went cold before my mind even caught up. I called my 38-year-old son, Preston. Over the sound of airport announcements, he told me, almost bored, that he'd sold it. "Dad's gone, Mom. Why are you hoarding a piece of scrap metal in an empty garage?" His wife Monica had been severely depressed, he said. She needed a trip to Paris to clear her head. First class, 5-star hotels. Get over it, it's just a car. I stood there in that garage, devastated, until my phone rang again an hour later. Victor Rollins, a classic car dealer who'd known Robert for 30 years, who'd spent countless Saturday afternoons arguing with him over carburetors and original parts. His voice was different this time. Tight, urgent. "Eleanor," he said, "your son just dumped the Shelby here for a quick cash wire. You need to come down." Robert left something hidden inside the door panel. "You need to see this with your own eyes." It was exactly 6 months since I'd buried my husband. 42 years of marriage, gone in the blink of an eye to a sudden heart attack on an ordinary Sunday morning. He was the fire in my life. The steady hand that helped me build Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics from a single rented delivery truck into a fleet of 400 refrigerated trucks, stretching across the entire Midwest. I ran the numbers, the contracts, the negotiations. He ran the garage. That car was his sanctuary. 25 years of restoration, every bolt and every panel sourced and fitted with his own hands. Since he passed, I went out there every morning, just to smell the oil and leather, just to stand in the quiet and feel close to him one more time. That Tuesday, I opened the heavy door with a cup of coffee in my hand and stopped dead in my tracks. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the concrete, hot liquid splashing over my shoes. I barely felt it. The garage was empty, violently, impossibly empty. No broken windows, no forced locks, no alarm triggers. Someone with the codes had done this. Someone who knew exactly how to bypass the sensors without leaving a trace. My mind raced through the short list of people who had both the codes and the physical keys. My estate manager, currently on vacation in Florida, and my son. I called Preston. He was at O'Hare, boarding a flight to Europe, his voice entirely too casual for what he was about to tell me. "I sold it," he said, flat, like he was reporting the weather. "Mom, Dad's been gone 6 months. It's just sitting there gathering dust, making you miserable every time you walk past it. Monica needs this. I did it for my wife's mental health. You always put Dad first. I'm just doing the same for mine. Get over it, Mom. It's just a car." Then the boarding call swallowed his voice, and the line went dead. I stood in that empty garage long after the call ended, his words still ringing in my ears. He actually believed his own excuse. He expected me to accept that he'd stolen his father's most treasured possession to fund a European vacation for a woman who hadn't shed a single genuine tear at the funeral, who had, in fact, complained loudly about the caterer during the wake. But grief has a strange way of clarifying things once the shock wears off. I walked back into the house and sat at my desk, and something colder began to settle where the hurt had been. A lavish first-class trip to Paris, even at its most extravagant, might cost $40,000. I knew exactly what that Shelby was worth. Robert and I had it appraised for insurance just a year earlier. $350,000, fully restored, numbers matching. Where was the other $310,000? Preston was arrogant. He was entitled. But he wasn't foolish enough to torch a small fortune just to buy plane tickets. He was hiding something. And the Paris story was nothing but a smokescreen. A cheap, convenient lie, designed to make me angry about his entitlement, instead of suspicious of what he was actually doing with that money. I reached for the phone to call my attorney, Rachel Thorne. I intended to freeze his trust access immediately, to begin the paperwork removing him from my will entirely. Before my finger could land on her name, the phone buzzed again. Victor. His voice had lost its business tone completely. "Forget the wire transfer for a minute," he said. When he dropped the car off, my guys did a standard intake inspection. The passenger door panel was misaligned, just a fraction of an inch off. Eleanor. Robert was meticulous. He would never have left a panel like that. Victor had popped it open to recheck the clips, and what he found underneath changed everything. "Your husband didn't just leave a car here. He left something inside the door cavity. It's addressed to you. You need to come down to the warehouse right now." I drove across town with my hands trembling on the wheel, my mind racing through decades of marriage, trying to imagine what Robert could possibly have hidden in the one place he loved most. Robert hadn't just been my husband. For 30 years he'd served as my company's chief financial officer, a mind like a steel trap, an instinct for spotting deception that seemed almost supernatural. If a man like that had taken the time to hide something deep inside the structure of his most prized possession, it wasn't sentiment. It was a weapon, an insurance policy. Victor was waiting for me, in the receiving bay of his warehouse, when I arrived, standing silently beside the Shelby, under harsh fluorescent light. He didn't greet me the way he normally did. He simply gestured toward the passenger door, where the interior panel had been carefully removed and laid on a workbench, the mechanical guts of the door exposed. Buried behind a thick layer of soundproofing was a rectangular void where something had once been glued in place. Victor reached into his jacket and handed me a fireproof document bag, sealed with waterproof tape. Inside, I could see a black USB drive and a folded sheet of heavy parchment paper, Robert's preferred stationery. My hands, which had stayed perfectly steady through decades of brutal contract negotiations, shook as I sliced open the tape and unfolded the letter. I recognized his handwriting instantly, and the date at the top of the page stopped my breath in my throat. 14 days before the heart attack that took him from me. He had sat down and written this letter 2 weeks before he died, knowing, somehow, that his time was running short. "Eleanor," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means our son took the bait." I forced myself to keep reading. He wrote that I had always wanted to believe the best about Preston, that his arrogance was a phase, that Monica's greed was simply youthful ignorance he'd eventually outgrow. But Robert had spent his life tracking liabilities, and our son, he said, was the greatest liability this family had ever produced. He'd hidden a pre-signed blank title to the Shelby in the bottom of the glove box, knowing that the moment he was gone, Preston would come looking for liquid cash to feed Monica's endless appetite for luxury. He wanted to test him. He wanted to see if Preston would honor what we'd built, or sell it off the second no one was watching. "If this letter is in your hands right now, you have your answer." I had to stop reading for a moment, my chest heaving, the full weight of what my husband had done, from beyond the grave settling over me like a physical thing. He had orchestrated a posthumous loyalty test, and our son had failed it in the most spectacular, offensive way imaginable. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't mourned. He'd simply seen his father's death as an opportunity to cash a blank check. The letter continued. "But this isn't just about a stolen car, Eleanor. Preston isn't simply a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. He's actively funding a betrayal that will systematically destroy everything we spent our lives building. The drive in this bag contains 6 months of investigation. Look at the banking routes. Don't let your mother's heart blind you to the cold, hard math. Burn the rot out of our house. Do what must be done." I plugged that drive into Victor's secure laptop, with hands that had once negotiated hostile takeovers, without so much as a tremor. What I found gutted me completely. Preston's Paris trip was nothing but a decoy. Flights and a luxury boutique hotel near the Louvre, booked on a Tuesday morning and quietly cancelled 48 hours later. The real travel manifest told a very different story. A private charter flight, departing from a small regional airfield, final destination Georgetown, capital of the Cayman Islands, one of the world's most notorious offshore banking havens. The missing $310,000 wasn't funding a vacation. It was seed capital for a hostile offshore acquisition. My son, using insider knowledge he had no right to weaponize, was quietly plotting to buy out Vanguard Refrigerated Transport, my company's single largest and most vicious rival for over a decade. But as I dug deeper, it became painfully clear that Preston didn't have the mind to engineer something like this alone. Buried in a folder of intercepted emails was the truth. My vice president of operations, Bradley, a man I had personally hired 6 years earlier, mentored, trusted with the keys to my empire, was the real architect. He had fed Preston an elaborate fantasy of ruling the market together, when in truth my son was nothing more than the necessary bloodline connection required to move untraceable capital. Bradley provided the blueprint, Preston provided the stolen cash. And once the acquisition succeeded, Bradley intended to funnel every profitable contract straight into his own offshore account, an account Preston had absolutely no legal claim to. And then I found the folder labeled simply with Monica's name. My stomach turned to ice. 2 years of photographs, hotel receipts, hundreds of captured text messages. It wasn't corporate espionage. It was a digital diary of a long, brazen affair. Monica and Bradley, laughing in message after message about how easy it was to manipulate my son's insecurities, how desperate he was to finally step out of his mother's shadow, how simple it had been to convince him that stealing from his own family was a brilliant business move. Buried deeper still was the final, most devastating layer, a locked spreadsheet detailing their true plan. Once the acquisition succeeded, Bradley and Monica intended to bleed Preston completely dry and disappear together with the offshore fortune, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of a federal fraud investigation, facing decades in prison while they vanished to some sunlit beach. I sat back in that chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating a grief that had already begun transforming into something entirely different. The heavy, suffocating sorrow of losing Robert began to burn away, replaced by a rising, ice-cold fury. Preston had looked me in the eye and told me to get over it. He had used my grief as a shield, used Monica's fabricated depression as a weapon against my sympathy, turned his father's memory into a stepping stone for his own corporate treason. He believed my silence these past 6 months was surrender, that I was simply a broken old widow, waiting to fade quietly into the background. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I did not build Caldwell cold chain logistics from a single rusted delivery truck by turning the other cheek. I called Rachel Thorne that same night. Freeze every account Preston and Monica can touch. Every single one. Strip his signatory powers across the company entirely. Lock him out of every server we own. Rachel warned me the fallout would be immediate. Automated mortgage payments bouncing, credit cards declining, questions from the board by morning. Let them ask their questions, I told her. I own the majority of the voting shares, and I built this company from nothing. Then I called Victor. Don't call the police. File a formal stolen asset dispute through federal banking channels instead. I want their offshore accounts flagged as high risk before their plane even lands. The next morning, I walked into headquarters, exactly the way I always did. At 7 o'clock sharp, my shoulders deliberately stooped, my pace deliberately slow, playing the part of the tired, grieving widow to absolute perfection. I called Bradley into my office and told him, in a voice thick with rehearsed exhaustion, that I needed to step back. I was promoting him to acting chief executive of the Midwestern Division, granting him full legal authority over the Vanguard merger accounts. I watched a flicker of raw, unguarded greed cross his face before he buried it beneath another layer of false concern. He had no idea he was signing a confession, tying his name and signature to every fraudulent transaction he was about to commit. I sat there in the dim light of my office and let him walk out believing he'd just been handed the keys to everything. 48 hours passed. I sat at home watching digital tracking software log every keystroke as Bradley frantically pushed stolen capital through corporate channels late into the night, entirely unaware that Rachel Thorne had already flagged those exact offshore accounts with international fraud alerts. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and I hadn't had to lift a finger. The explosion came precisely at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. My phone rang. Preston, breathless, panicked, standing at a concierge desk in a 5-star Cayman Islands resort, his corporate card declining, his personal card rejected, his trust account showing a balance of exactly zero. I played the confused, oblivious mother perfectly, promising I'd call the bank on Monday, telling him to enjoy the beautiful French architecture and eat a croissant for me. He couldn't correct me without confessing he wasn't in Paris at all, without unraveling the entire lie he'd spent weeks constructing. I hung up and let him drown quietly in his own deception. Victor called minutes later, laughing under his breath at what he'd just done. Preston had phoned the shop, begging, practically screaming, demanding Victor release the wire transfer immediately. Victor told him the state had already flagged the Shelby's title as a stolen asset, that federal investigators had frozen the funds under suspicion of international money laundering. The hostile acquisition collapsed instantly. Stranded, humiliated, evicted from their oceanfront suite, Preston and Monica had to beg Monica's distant relatives for 2 emergency tickets on a budget airline just to get home. A humiliating journey in cramped middle seats, surrounded by exactly the kind of people they'd always considered beneath them. When they finally burst through my front doors days later, disheveled, furious, demanding I unlock their accounts and wire them $100,000 for damages, I said nothing at all. I simply rose from my chair and led them into the formal dining room, where the lights had been deliberately left off. I flicked on the chandelier. Waiting at the table were Rachel Thorne, Victor Rollins, and a federal agent named Miller from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. Bradley sat slumped at the far end, already broken, sweat soaking through his collar. I laid it all out calmly, methodically. The forged signatures, the frozen offshore accounts, the flight manifest proving they had never gone anywhere near Paris. Bradley cracked first, confessing in a hollow whisper that he'd forged Preston's signature because he needed a wealthy, gullible name to bypass internal audits. Preston turned on his wife in horrified disbelief, and that was the moment I played Robert's final piece of evidence. Hidden surveillance footage from their own living room, recorded months before he died, showing Monica and Bradley locked in an affair, laughing together about how easy Preston was to manipulate, planning to leave him holding a 20-year federal sentence while they vanished together to some private beach. Preston lunged across the table and beat Bradley bloody before Agent Miller pulled him off and pinned him to my Persian rug. Monica screamed and thrashed as the agents cuffed her wrists, dragging her toward the door. Bradley offered no resistance at all, simply wept as they led him away. And at the very last moment, before the heavy oak doors could close behind him, Preston broke free and crawled across the floor to my feet, clutching my knees, sobbing, begging me to make it all disappear. I looked down at the man I had raised for 38 years, fed, educated, protected, loved beyond measure, and I told him the truth, as gently and as coldly as I could manage. My son died the same day his father did. What remained kneeling in front of me was nothing but a thief. I stepped back, and I let them take him. 6 months have passed since that night. Preston pled guilty to grand theft and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. 5 years in a state correctional facility. He looked for me in the gallery during his sentencing hearing. I didn't attend. I had mourned the loss of my son a long time before that day, and I chose instead to focus on the living. Monica and Bradley turned on each other viciously in federal court, each accusing the other of orchestrating the entire scheme, and were both sentenced to 10 years for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and international money laundering. Their dream of a private beach became cold concrete and steel bars. With the rot finally cut away, I turned my full attention back to Caldwell Cold Chain Logistics. I purged the entire executive floor. Every director and manager who had enabled Bradley, or simply looked away, was gone within weeks. I didn't hire outside executives with polished resumes and empty promises. I promoted from the warehouse floor instead. The loyal supervisors and coordinators who had spent decades building this company with their own hands, who knew the business better than any boardroom politician ever could. The $350,000 the federal government eventually recovered from those frozen Cayman accounts did not go back into my corporate holdings. I knew exactly what Robert would have wanted. I used every cent to establish the Robert Caldwell Cardiovascular Research Foundation, funding medical research into the prevention of sudden heart failure. His name would never again be associated with a stolen car and a fraudulent shell company. It would be associated with saving lives, extending his legacy far beyond the short time we'd had left together. This evening, the sky above Chicago is a brilliant wash of bruised purple and burning orange. I walk slowly through my quiet garage until I reach the far corner, where the Shelby sits exactly where it belongs, its polished blue paint gleaming in the fading light. I slide into the leather seat, run my hand over the smooth wooden steering wheel, Robert restored with his own 2 hands, and turn the key. The engine roars to life, deep and powerful, shaking the foundation of the garage the same way it always did. I pull out of the driveway and drive slowly into the glowing horizon, knowing my husband would be proud of the choices I made to protect everything we spent our lives building together. Greed is a venom that blinds you to the very hands that fed you. When you treat family as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, you forfeit every right to their loyalty, their protection, and their love. True legacy is never built on what you can inherit or steal. It's built on integrity, on hard work, and on the respect you show to those who paved the way before you. Never mistake an old woman's silence for weakness. And never underestimate a mother's willingness to burn her own empire to the ground, just to make certain the wolves don't get the feast.